It began with the hiss of a can opener and the quiet of disbelief. In the Kansas wind of 1943, the captured soldiers of the Africa Corps sat cross-legged inside a wooden barrack at Camp Concordia, their uniforms still dusty from Tunisia, their stomachs tightened by weeks of transport across the Atlantic. Before them lay an object they had never seen, a GI lunch kit, stamped metal, olive drab, sealed with care. It had traveled across oceans, not for them, but for someone else. Someone who had expected to open it on a far brighter day. Sergeant Kurt Weiss turned the kit in his hands. On its lid, a small paper tag read, "Keep this sealed until home." The ink had faded, but the promise was clear. It was not a command. It was a hope. A lunch prepared for a man who intended to survive. Weiss exhaled, the air leaving his lungs with the sound of sand shifting in a desert breeze. They broke the seal carefully, as though opening another man's diary. Inside lay sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a bar of chocolate, a folded napkin, a small tin of coffee, and a photograph. A young woman smiling beside a Ford pickup holding a pie. Private Helmut Browning, once a machinist from Bremen, stared at it for a long time. Then, in his quiet German-accented English, he murmured, "They eat to come home. We ate only to stay alive." That sentence lingered in the barrack like smoke. Outside, a train whistle moaned over the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, farmers were plowing wheat for the next shipment of flour to Europe, part of the war effort that never slept. Camp Concordia itself was a small city of paradoxes. Built in 1943 to hold nearly 4,000 prisoners, it had electric lights that burned all night, a theater, even a library stocked by local volunteers. The Americans called it the Humane Camp. Each day, trucks arrived from nearby farms carrying crates of corn, potatoes, butter, and meat. Ingredients rationed, but never entirely gone. The prisoners watched in silence as the guards unpacked the food. In their homeland, ration cards had reduced families to scraping thin soups. Here, even in captivity, there was abundance. A corporal passed by, noticing the open kit. "That one belonged to Private Leroy Hughes," he said. "He didn't make it through Kasserine." The room fell silent. They were eating the meal of a dead man who had packed for life. Later that night, Weiss wrote in his small field notebook, one of the few items allowed after inspection, "Camp Concordia, Kansas." The Americans are strange. They prepare meals as if peace were already certain. The bread is soft, the coffee sweet. Their confidence tastes almost arrogant. Perhaps that is their secret, believing they will return before they even leave. The entry ended without a period, as if his thoughts had been interrupted. The next morning, the prisoners were assigned to farm work. They rode on the backs of trucks past fields golden with wheat. For every 5 prisoners, 1 guard, an easy ratio reflecting trust. In those fields, they learned a different kind of rhythm. When the lunch bell rang, the guards opened identical kits, some labeled Tuesday Meal C, others Sunday Special. They laid them on checked cloths and invited the Germans to sit. The Americans' ritual of eating was methodical. Grace first, utensils placed right, food divided evenly. No one ate standing. It was a ceremony of order in a chaotic world. Weiss observed that even during harvest, when the air smelled of sweat and fuel, they preserved manners as though civilization itself depended on the angle of a knife. He thought back to Ella Gala, where he had once shared a single tin of beans with 6 men under artillery fire. They had eaten with their hands, crouched in sand. There had been no napkin, no pause for words of thanks, only survival. Here, even in war, the Americans built a space between hunger and hope. Private Hughes' lunch kit remained in the barrack. Each night, one of the Germans would open it again, study the handwriting on the tag, and close it slowly. The message became a relic, a scripture of endurance. Keep this sealed until home. To them, it spoke not of victory, but of promise. A promise that one might live to see another table, another dawn. In the camp's archive, decades later, that tag would still exist, pressed between 2 sheets of paper, cataloged under artifacts of morale. A curator would note its condition, slightly torn, ink faded, yet legible. Evidence of emotional logistics in wartime America. There is something haunting in that phrase. Emotional logistics. The idea that a nation could ship hope across oceans sealed inside a lunchbox. At dusk, The Kansas sky glowed orange. Prisoners gathered outside their huts. A radio from the guardhouse played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Weiss looked at the horizon and whispered to Browning, "They fight to return to this." Browning nodded. "And that," he said, "is why they cannot be broken." The camera would hold on that moment. The fading light, the tin box on a wooden table, the tag fluttering in a soft wind. A meal that waited for a man who never came back, yet fed the souls of those he once fought. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? The morning sun over Camp Concordia was sharp and clean, reflecting off rows of mess tins laid out for inspection. Inside one of them, Weiss found something wrapped in golden foil, a small packet of real butter stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster 1943. He turned it in his fingers as if it might vanish. Butter. Not margarine, not lard, but true butter. When Browning peeled the corner open, the scent drifted through the barrack, sweet, creamy, unmistakably domestic. It clashed with the stale odor of machine oil and canvas that clung to every uniform. A younger prisoner, Corporal Menzel, laughed at the absurdity. "Butter in war," he said. "We could not get this even at home before Tunisia fell." The guards didn't react. To them, it was normal. The Americans had a system that could mass-produce comfort. In 1943, the U.S. produced over 800 million pounds of butter, despite fighting on two fronts, despite rationing. Housewives in Wisconsin and Minnesota worked shifts at creameries before dawn, sending shipments west to California for packaging. Butter wasn't merely food, it was morale wrapped in wax paper. That packet became a mystery to the prisoners. Why would an army carry such luxury into battle? To the German mind, butter was a peacetime indulgence, a softness to be purged. Their propaganda minister had once declared, "Guns will make us strong, butter will only make us fat." But here, in the hands of their captors, butter had become an emblem of humanity preserved amid war. At lunchtime, Weiss spread a thin layer on a piece of white bread from the same GI kit. He let it melt in the Kansas heat before taking a bite. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The flavor carried him back to his mother's kitchen in Bremen, 1938, before the marches, before the uniforms. She had served buttered bread with sugar sprinkled on top. He hadn't tasted that in years. Nearby, an American corporal named Tom Reed watched the scene unfold. He had grown up on a dairy farm outside Des Moines and had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Seeing the Germans marvel over something so ordinary made him pause. He reached into his own kit, took out a second butter packet, and placed it silently on their table. No words, no translation, just the shared understanding that small kindness could survive barbed wire. That night, in his journal, Weiss wrote again, "Today I tasted the enemy's butter. It smelled of home. I cannot explain the feeling. For the first time since Africa, I remembered breakfast, not war." The camp's canteen lights glowed long after curfew. Somewhere outside, diesel trucks groaned past, hauling supplies east. Every pound of butter, every loaf of bread had traveled on rail lines guarded by teenagers and widowed mothers. America's industrial heart beat in rhythm with its kitchens. Even the guards seemed to understand this connection. They spoke often of the home front, as if it were a living person. "My wife sends cookies every month," one said proudly, holding up a tin. "She says if we stop baking, we stop believing." The Germans listened in silence. Belief was something they had been taught to surrender to orders, but here it was tied to flavor, scent, and memory. A rumor spread in the camp that American soldiers carried butter because it reminded them they were fighting to return, not to conquer. One of the POWs, a former cook named Franz Keller, began saving the foil wrappers. He flattened them carefully and pressed them into a notebook, labeling each one with the date and name of the guard who had shared it. Years later, that same notebook would be displayed in a museum in Stuttgart under the caption, "Evidence of Mercy, 1943. As autumn arrived, rations grew tighter, but the butter remained. Small, deliberate, persistent. It became a metaphor whispered among the men. The butter that smelled like peace, they called it. One evening, while polishing tools for the farm crew, Browning spoke quietly. "They have found a way to make kindness an industry." Weiss nodded. "Yes," he said, "and perhaps that is why they will never lose." The The wind outside carried the faint scent of wheat and diesel. Inside, the empty butterfoil caught the lamplight, glowing like a relic from another world. When historians later asked why morale among American troops remained so high through 1943, some pointed to weapons, some to propaganda, others to pay. But there were smaller truths sealed in foil, truths that smelled of home. The butter packet taught more than any sermon, that democracy's real strength wasn't its factories, but its refusal to let war erase tenderness. The next discovery seemed insignificant at first. A tiny white envelope tucked beside a tin of beans. On its paper surface shimmered a faint blue star, no larger than a thumbnail. It was a packet of salt. Simple, ordinary, disposable. Yet for the prisoners of Camp Concordia, it became a revelation more startling than the butter or the bread. Corporal Menzel tore it open, letting the crystals fall onto his palm. "American salt," he whispered, almost amused. "Even their seasoning has a flag." The men chuckled softly, but Weiss was silent. He had noticed how the American soldiers treated these packets with a kind of quiet reverence. They didn't tear them carelessly. They poured a pinch, sealed the rest, tucked it neatly back into their lunch kits. To them, it was part of a ritual. That evening, as the prisoners worked alongside local farmers stacking hay, Weiss saw it again. During the break, an older farmer named Henry Clarkson opened his own meal, a thermos of coffee, bread, and beans. Before eating, he sprinkled salt carefully over his food, then tapped the leftover grains into the soil. Seeing the German's curiosity, he said simply, "My wife always told me, share a little salt with the earth and it'll remember you kindly." Weiss didn't reply, but later that night, as he ate his beans from a mess tin, he borrowed one of those packets and did the same. Salt. A small pinch of salt over the soil behind the barrack. It was a quiet gesture, almost foolish, yet it made him feel part of something older than war. In the American Army, these small customs had roots deeper than strategy. The Quartermaster Corps had standardized the individual ration packet in 1942. Each contained exactly 0.25 ounces of iodized salt, a logistical miracle multiplied by millions. In that same year, the U.S. shipped over 180 million salt packets to troops overseas. But for many soldiers, salt was more than chemistry. It was a link to home, to kitchens where mothers salted stews or fathers preserved meat for winter. Letters from soldiers captured this attachment. One from Private Charles D. Meyer, dated March 1943, read, "Funny thing, when we open our rations, the smell of that salt makes me think of home fries on a Sunday morning. You can't fight homesickness, but you can taste it." The Germans didn't have anything like it. Their field rations, especially in the desert, were austere. Black bread, dried sausage, sometimes ersatz coffee, often without seasoning. Food was fuel. To them, the Americans' preoccupation with flavor seemed sentimental, even weak. But the more they saw, the more they realized. This sentimentality was the strength. It preserved something the Reich had buried, the belief that even in destruction, life deserves small pleasures. Weeks later, a shipment of new rations arrived. Each American kit bore the same star-stamped packet. A few had been torn open and resealed with tape, proof that some soldier had wanted to keep it for later. Weiss collected several and lined them on his bunk. They looked like tiny flags. Browning, sitting nearby, said quietly, "They carry their home in every meal." Weiss nodded, "And we carry only our orders." Outside, the wind swept across the plains. The guards' mess hall glowed in the distance. Laughter, the clatter of cutlery, the faint hiss of a coffee pot. Those sounds pierced the barrack's silence more than any gunfire. At dawn, frost gathered on the fences. The prisoners lined up for roll call. One of them, a young man from Hamburg, sneezed repeatedly, his breath white in the cold. A guard noticed and tossed him a salt packet. "For your soup later," he said, then added with a grin, "or to remind you the world still has taste." That phrase would echo among the prisoners for weeks. The world still has taste. In December 1943, a Red Cross inspector visited Camp Concordia and noted in his report that morale among the POWs was surprisingly high. No one realized that part of that morale came not from sermons or propaganda, but from a seasoning packet that connected enemies through memory. That night, Weiss wrote his shortest entry yet. "Salt is small. But so was the star that guided wise men. He folded the page, placed it beside the packet, and closed his eyes. Somewhere beyond the fences, the earth that had received his pinch of salt was now frozen, holding its silent promise. And for the first time in years, he dreamed not of orders, but of a dinner table where people ate slowly, talked softly, and lived like peace was possible. They found it during inventory inspection, an ordinary sandwich wrapped in wax paper, soft bread pressed flat by weeks of travel. Yet on its wrapper, in pencil barely visible, someone had written, "For a hungry buddy." No name, no rank, no unit. Just that brief line. A relic of quiet generosity tucked inside a soldier's lunch kit. Weiss lifted it gently, his fingers trembling as if holding a letter from another world. Around him, the barrack fell silent. Every man could read enough English to understand. For a hungry buddy. The words felt foreign. In the Wehrmacht, you shared rations only when ordered, and even then, it was calculation, not compassion. Private Browning stared at the sandwich as though it might speak. "They teach kindness the way we were taught discipline," he murmured, "through habit." The American guards didn't notice the commotion. For them, leaving an extra sandwich was ordinary. It was tradition. Before a patrol or an air raid, soldiers often left behind buddy bites, little gestures of reassurance, an extra cigarette, a chocolate bar, a folded sandwich wrapped with someone's initials. The idea was simple. Someone might come back hungry, and there should always be something waiting. It was these unrecorded customs, born in mess tents and foxholes, that gave morale its invisible backbone. A quartermaster report from 1944 listed over 1.2 million field lunches distributed across the U.S. home front training bases, each packed by civilians who often slipped in small notes. "You'll be home soon," or "Save this for a friend." The war machinery of democracy included affection as part of its logistics. Inside Camp Concordia, the gesture sparked quiet debate. Some prisoners scoffed, sentimentality, weakness. Others, usually the younger men, seemed uneasy. "If our own officers had written that," Menzel said, "they'd be accused of softness." Weiss only replied, "And yet, softness survives longer than iron." That evening, a local woman named Evelyn Ward came to the camp with a group of Red Cross volunteers. They distributed books, magazines, and clean cloths. She spoke slowly in English, explaining each item's purpose, smiling often. To the prisoners, her kindness felt staged. But when she paused at their table, she pointed at the sandwich and said, "That's an old American habit. We don't like to think anyone will go hungry alone." Browning translated for the others. Then quietly Weiss asked, "Even your enemies?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Especially them," she said, and moved on. That night, the prisoners couldn't sleep. The barrack smelled faintly of bread and wax paper. Somewhere outside, a dog barked near the gate. Weiss opened his notebook again. "There is a different kind of discipline here," he wrote. "It is not shouted. It is shared." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he tore a piece of his own rationed bread, wrapped it in the wax paper from the GI sandwich, and wrote in his best English, "For a hungry man." He placed it on the windowsill before lights out. The next morning, it was gone. No one admitted to taking it. But someone, an unseen hand, perhaps a guard, perhaps another prisoner, had left a single American coin in its place, a nickel polished bright. It became a legend in Barrack 8. They called it the trade of silence, a sandwich for a coin, a gesture for a gesture. Years later, a historian found that nickel in Weiss's effects, carefully wrapped in paper. On it was a single note, for the man who shared without knowing who would eat. The sandwich had indeed spoken, not in words, but in the universal grammar of empathy, the kind that made enemies pause and, for a heartbeat, recognize themselves. In one of his last letters, written before repatriation, Weiss reflected on the discovery. "I used to think war stripped men of softness. I was wrong. It reveals whose softness was built from strength. That sandwich, molded and stale, had become more than food. It was a message in 2 lines of pencil, that a nation's true morale lies not in command, but in the instinct to care for someone unseen." The camera might close in here. On the folded wax paper, faint pencil marks barely visible, and beyond it, the barrack door creaking open to the Kansas dawn. A whisper passes among the prisoners. A single sandwich, enough to make enemies stop chewing. By late autumn 1943, the Kansas air had turned crisp. The harvest was nearly over, the fields thinning to stubble under gray skies. The prisoners, accustomed to desert heat, found the cold strange but cleansing. That morning, while unloading supply crates from a truck bound for the camp's kitchen, Corporal Browning noticed something that didn't belong among the tins and boxes. A single apple, red bruised, wrapped in paper. He lifted it, expecting it to be rotten. Instead, it was merely cold, its skin hard with frost. When he brought it into the barrack, the others gathered around. "It's real," Weiss said softly, "not canned." The apple had the faint, waxy sheen of something grown by a human hand, not stamped from a factory. For men who had eaten mostly powdered potatoes and dry sausage, the fruit felt impossible, a luxury even officers at the front rarely saw. Someone had scrawled on the wrapping, "From Yakima Orchards, Washington State." The name meant nothing to them, but the thought of orchards existing while cities burned across Europe was almost absurd. Weiss sliced it in half with a dull knife. The flesh had browned, the sweetness fading. Still, the smell filled the room, faint, earthy, alive. Menzel joked, "America fights with desserts." No one laughed. They took turns tasting it, a small bite each, chewing slowly as if it were sacred. Browning, who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, said quietly, "They carry freshness into battle. That means they still believe in tomorrow." In 1943 alone, the United States shipped over 5 million pounds of fresh fruit to domestic bases and hospitals. Apples, oranges, even bananas imported from Cuba. It was part of a morale plan issued by the Quartermaster General's office called Project Fresh. The goal, keep soldiers reminded of civilian life, the world waiting for them beyond the war. In contrast, German logistics emphasized endurance, not comfort. There was no tomorrow in their rations, only calories and discipline. That difference was invisible in statistics but enormous in spirit. To a man starving for hope, a fresh apple could feel like a prophecy. That night, Weiss couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, polishing the apple's seeds with his fingers. Outside, frost painted the wire fences silver. In the distance, the guard tower's light rotated slowly, slicing through the cold. He thought of his son, 6 years old when he left Bremen. His wife had written once, long ago, "We keep the last apple for Christmas. Little Hans waits for you before he eats it." The memory struck hard, and suddenly, the barrack didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a waiting room for men who had forgotten what they were waiting for. The next morning, Weiss planted the seeds behind the laundry shack. A useless act, perhaps, but a defiant one. "If we ever come back," he said to Browning, "maybe something will have grown." Weeks passed. The winter came early. Snow blanketed the camp, muffling every sound except the hum of trucks and the clang of pots. The apple story spread from barrack to barrack. Guards started leaving their own fruit for the prisoners now and then, sometimes oranges, sometimes another apple. The Germans began saving the peels, drying them above the stove, perfuming their hut with something faintly like home. During roll call, a guard named Reed noticed the scent. "Smells like my mother's pie," he said. He smiled, and for the first time, Weiss smiled back. Months later, the Red Cross report would note, "At Camp Concordia, morale among prisoners is high despite isolation. Shared food experiences seem to foster mutual respect." But reports never captured what it felt like. That one evening, when Browning bit the last slice of the apple, looked at the horizon, and said, "They aren't afraid of dying, because they still plan to live after this." The camera would linger on the apple core in his hand, the seeds missing, the frost glinting off the fence wire. Then a quiet question for the viewers. If you were in their place, hungry, far from home, would a simple apple remind you of life, or of everything you had lost? The screen fades to black on that question, the sound of a train whistle echoing through the frozen plains. Spring returned to Kansas with a kind of slow mercy. The snow melted, the camp's gardens turned green, and the prisoners' routines settled into quiet discipline. Each morning, they lined up for inspection, then marched to the fields or the workshops, always under the same wide sky. By then, the men had grown accustomed to American ways, clean barracks, polite guards, punctual meals. But one morning, something small and absurd changed everything. During supply check, Browning opened a new ration crate marked Fort Riley Commissary, 1944. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a complete dining kit: a fork, a knife, a spoon, and a folded napkin. The utensils were stainless steel, engraved U.S. Army. He laughed aloud. They issue forks for war? The others gathered around. The utensils gleamed in the light, perfectly arranged, not a scratch on them. Weiss lifted the fork, feeling its balance. It was smooth, cold, solid, the kind of craftsmanship reserved for officers in Europe, not common soldiers. Even their tools eat with dignity, he muttered. Later that day, the guards joined the prisoners for lunch in the open field. No one spoke much. The Americans unrolled their napkins, set out utensils, and ate calmly, even under the wind. When a shell from the nearby training range thudded in the distance, one of them chuckled, wiped his mouth, and kept eating. The Germans froze at the sound, but the Americans didn't even flinch. When Weiss asked how they could stay so composed, one guard, a young corporal named Sam Harris, replied evenly, "We eat proper, even when the world falls apart. Because if we eat like beasts, we'll fight like beasts." It struck Weiss like a sermon. That line, simple, unpretentious, summed up something he'd never understood about his captors. Their discipline wasn't fear-driven. It was chosen. It came from culture, not command. That night, the prisoners held their own meal quietly. They laid out tin plates, divided their bread evenly, wiped the table before eating. No one spoke of the fork, but everyone copied its order. It was a silent imitation of what they had seen, and yet it felt right. Weiss later wrote, "The Americans have a civilization that survives even in rations. They believe the manner of living matters as much as life itself." From a logistical standpoint, such order was no accident. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had standardized utensil distribution since 1942. Each mess kit was designed for reuse, part of an ethical code that valued cleanliness and respect for food. It wasn't luxury, it was a system of meaning, a reflection of a society that didn't let chaos define it. When a new batch of POWs arrived from Italy, hardened men who had seen Naples bombed and comrades starve, they were astonished to see Americans handing prisoners forks and napkins. "In Europe, they gave us sticks," one muttered. "Here, they give us silver." It was small things like this that transformed the camp. Tension faded. The barracks grew quieter. Prisoners began sweeping the floors more carefully, folding their blankets in straight lines. They had absorbed something invisible, the dignity of order. A week later, an argument broke out in Barrack 12 over a missing utensil. Menzel had borrowed a spoon and forgotten to return it. Weiss intervened before it escalated. "No shouting," he said. "We'll settle it as they would." He laid out the remaining utensils, divided them, and set one aside. "Whoever needs it most, take it. The rest, keep the table straight." It was such a small act, but it carried the echo of something larger. Civility as resistance against chaos. Outside, the Kansas wind rustled the flags above the gate. Beyond the fence, women in floral dresses were hanging laundry, their voices drifting like music across the fields. War was still raging an ocean away, yet here, order had turned survival into something almost graceful. That evening, when dinner ended, Weiss cleaned the fork carefully, wrapped it in a napkin, and placed it back in its box. He whispered, not a prayer, but a realization. They fight to protect the way they live, not the way they rule. And for the first time, he envied that. To the viewers, one question lingers. In times of chaos, do we cling to order out of fear, or because it reminds us what it means to be human? By the spring of 1945, Camp Concordia was quieter. The radio brought word of Allied advances in Europe, and each announcement passed through the barracks like a gust of wind, soft, then gone. Some men cheered in secret, others stared at the floor. For the German prisoners, the war had shrunk to a few acres of Kansas soil. One afternoon, while clearing the mess hall after lunch, Browning found a GI lunch kit left open on the table. Inside were only fragments, one crumb of biscuit stuck to the corner, wrapped carefully in a napkin. He thought it was accidental until he saw the note folded beneath it. "Don't waste food. Someone worked for this." It was signed simply, Brevet T. Reed. Reed was the same guard who once shared butter packets with them, a man who joked easily but handled his rations with ritual care. Every meal, he bowed his head before eating, not out of piety, but gratitude. Now, even the crumb felt like part of that faith. Weiss picked up the lunch kit, turning it in his hands. The last crumb was small, hardly visible, but it was clean, preserved, intentional. "They treat food like memory," he whispered, "as if every bite deserves respect." The irony stung. The Reich had taught them that dignity came from conquest. Here, it seemed to come from preservation, from not wasting even the smallest thing that sustained life. Years later, records would show that the U.S. Army had reduced food waste by 41% between 1942 and 1945 through training campaigns that preached restraint as patriotism. Posters read, "Food fights for freedom, don't waste it." Housewives, school children, factory workers, everyone learned that respect for bread was part of the national character. To Weiss and his men, this was more than efficiency. It was culture. They had grown up in a world that glorified destruction. Yet here, even crumbs were guarded like relics. That night, the prisoners held what would be their last meal before repatriation orders arrived. The tables were bare pine. The guards served stew, potatoes, and a single biscuit each. Weiss broke his biscuit into 3 pieces and placed one on the napkin Reed had left. "For whoever comes after," he said simply. No one moved for a moment. Then one by one, the others followed, leaving part of their bread, a gesture both childish and profound. It was their way of saying they had learned something that couldn't be undone. When the war finally ended, the men boarded trains east. As they left the camp, Weiss turned for one last look. Through the open window, he saw a guard cleaning the empty tables. On one of them sat the lunch kit, closed tight, the metal catching the morning sun. The clank of the lid echoed like a bell, solemn and final. In his last diary entry before the ship home, Weiss wrote, "America feeds its men as if each meal were a promise. I came here as a soldier of iron, but I leave as a man who understands the holiness of bread." He tucked the note between the pages of his notebook, beside the butterfoil and the salt packet. Decades later, historians cataloged these objects under artifacts of empathy. The lunch kit, still dented from transport, bore the faint scratches of time. Inside, it remained one small napkin, yellowed with age, and a crumb so old it had turned to dust. But under museum lights, that dust glittered faintly, like a relic of human decency surviving the machinery of war. Some visitors wept, others whispered prayers. Most just stood there, silent, realizing that sometimes history isn't written in treaties or battles. It's written in crumbs, in how one man chooses to close a box gently instead of throwing it away. And the film would fade out slowly, the camera returning to that moment when the lid shut and the sound hung in the air like a benediction. A soldier's prayer, not for victory, but for decency. Years after Camp Concordia was dismantled, Kansas wheat grew where the barracks once stood. The wind erased the footprints, but not the memory. In museums, the small artifacts remain. A butterfoil, a salt packet, an apple seed that never sprouted, a fork polished by hands once called enemies, a single crumb of bread. Each object speaks softly, reminding us that the greatest revolutions in wartime happened not in strategy rooms, but at tables where men learned to eat like human beings again. For the captured soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the GI lunch kit became more than a meal. It was a mirror. Through its contents, they saw, for the first time, the quiet power of a nation that fought not from hatred, but from the conviction that even war could not erase civility. The Americans were not perfect. They had their prejudices, their propaganda. But in those small gestures lay something greater than ideology, faith in life beyond violence. Perhaps that is why the prisoners changed. Not through sermons or re-education, but through taste, order, and restraint. They discovered that a butter packet could teach mercy, a fork could restore dignity, and a crumb could outlast empire. When Weiss was an old man, he told a journalist, "We came home thinking America's strength was its weapons. We were wrong. It was their tables." And maybe that is how history should be remembered, not through the roar of engines, but through the silence after a meal, when a man folds his napkin, closes his lunch kit, and whispers a small promise to return home a better human being.